Curses of the Pharaohs, Ancient Egypt's Haunted Tombs. Section 1. The Tombs in Darkness. Fear of disturbing the dead. When you close your eyes and imagine the desert at night, you might hear the wind moving softly across endless sand dunes, the sound of grains scraping against stone, and the feeling of an ancient silence that has lasted for thousands of years. This is the silence of Egypt, a land that once held one of the most powerful civilizations the world has ever known. Yet, buried beneath the layers of golden history and majestic pyramids, lies a story that still unsettles those who dare to look closely. It is the story of the tombs of the Pharaohs, the resting places of kings who were never meant to be disturbed, and the curses that are said to guard them. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end. It was a passage, a journey that required careful preparation. Pharaohs, who were believed to be gods in human form, were given elaborate burials filled with treasures, food, weapons, and sacred objects meant to sustain them in the afterlife. Their tombs were not merely graves, but portals, gateways between the world of the living and the land of the dead. These tombs were built deep underground or hidden within the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, sealed with heavy stones and marked with inscriptions that warned intruders of the dangers that awaited them. You must imagine the experience of walking through those ancient passageways when they were first opened after centuries of silence. The air would have been heavy and stale, untouched since the time of the burial. Darkness surrounded every step, broken only by the flickering flame of a torch. The walls, decorated with hieroglyphs, seemed to whisper the same story again and again. The pharaoh was divine, his soul was eternal, and those who disturbed his rest would suffer. It was not merely superstition. To the Egyptians, it was law, the laws of gods and the laws of death. The first fear came from the texts themselves. Some tombs contained inscriptions that scholars have described as direct warnings. They spoke of death that would come to anyone who dared to desecrate the resting place of a king. In one tomb, an inscription read, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the pharaoh." Such words, carved into stone thousands of years ago, were not written as metaphors. They were believed to be literal protections. The Egyptians practiced powerful forms of magic, known as Heka, and for them, words had power. To carve a curse was to bring it into reality. It is easy for us, centuries later, to dismiss these as primitive fears. Yet consider how the archaeologists of the 19th and 20th centuries felt as they pushed open the sealed doors of a tomb. Aware of these warnings, the air that rushed out was not just ancient but sacred. The silence they broke was not just physical but spiritual. Even the most rational of men felt a chill. Long before the famous story of King Tutankhamen's tomb, there were whispers about misfortunes surrounding the opening of royal graves. In the early 19th century, tales spread of accidents, fevers, and deaths that followed excavations in Egypt. Sometimes they were blamed on the release of ancient bacteria trapped within the tombs, sometimes on sheer coincidence. But for those who lived through them, the explanations felt hollow. After all, it was not one death or one accident, but a pattern, an unsettling shadow that seemed to follow those who trespassed into the tombs. And so, a question formed in the minds of explorers. Were the pharaohs still guarding their eternal sleep? Imagine the scene in the Valley of the Kings, late in the day, as the sun sank below the cliffs. The shadows lengthened, and the heat of the day began to fade into a desert cold. Workers packed up their tools, leaving behind the half-dug earth and stone blocks. The valley would fall silent again, but for the occasional cry of a desert animal or the shifting of rocks in the wind. To those who stayed behind, the feeling was undeniable, as if the valley itself were watching. The tombs, even when sealed, seemed alive. This was not paranoia. The Egyptians designed their tombs to inspire awe and fear. Some were decorated with vivid images of gods with animal heads, holding knives, judging souls, or devouring the unworthy. For the living, stepping into such a place was like entering a dream or a nightmare. You might see the god Anubis, jackal-headed, standing over a body being embalmed. You might see serpents coiled around human figures, spitting fire. You might see the weighing of the heart against a feather, where the guilty were thrown into eternal darkness. The message was clear. This was sacred ground, and trespassers were not welcome. The very architecture was designed to mislead and trap. Some tombs contained false passages, pits, and blocked corridors meant to confuse thieves. Others contained mixtures of resins and substances that produced toxic fumes once exposed to air. There were practical dangers, but for the Egyptians, these practical dangers were only part of the curse. They believed in spiritual guardians, spirits of the dead, demons from the underworld, or even the Pharaoh himself, watching from beyond the grave. One can imagine how a laborer in ancient times might have felt, digging secretly into a tomb with hopes of stealing gold. His torch flickers, casting shadows across walls that seem alive. He knows the stories, the warnings his elders told him, that those who steal from the dead will be struck down. He feels the weight of the silence pressing on him. Perhaps he hears the faint sound of shifting stone or the rush of unseen air. His hands shake as he pries open a sarcophagus, and though he tells himself it is only stone, in his heart he feels that he has awakened something. Centuries later, when archaeologists came with more noble intentions, they still felt the same unease. They did not come to steal, but to study, to preserve history. Yet history itself resisted them. Tools broke, lamps went out, men fell ill. One by one, strange events piled up, and though scholars tried to explain them, the words of the old curses echoed louder. By the time Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, the legend of the Pharaoh's curse was already deeply embedded in public imagination. But what made Tutankhamun's tomb so different was that it seemed to confirm those fears in the most dramatic way. The sudden death of Lord Carnarvon, followed by the mysterious illnesses and deaths of others connected to the excavation, created a sensation worldwide. Newspapers called it proof of the curse, and the world watched as superstition and history intertwined. But that story comes later. To understand why the world reacted so strongly, we must remember what Egypt itself represented. It was not just another ancient civilization. It was a place of mysteries that seemed larger than life. Pyramids aligned with the stars, mummies preserved for eternity, temples filled with hieroglyphs that no one could read until the Rosetta Stone was discovered. Egypt was the land of secrets, and its tombs were the most secret of all. When we look back, it is tempting to dismiss the curses as exaggeration, as myth built upon coincidence. Yet, even today, archaeologists approach these places with caution, not just because of toxins or diseases, but because of respect. Whether you believe in curses or not, the fact remains. The fear of disturbing the dead was real, and it continues to haunt us even now. And so, we are left with a question. Were the pharaohs truly guarding their sleep with supernatural power? Or was the curse nothing more than the weight of history pressing down on those who dared to intrude? Section 2. Pharaoh's obsession with eternity and magical protections. The desert sands of Egypt have always held secrets, but none so carefully protected as the tombs of the pharaohs. In the ancient world, death was not seen as an end, but as a doorway to an eternal journey. A passage filled with dangers that had to be conquered with magic offerings and elaborate preparations. To the Egyptian mind, the afterlife was as real as the world of the living, and perhaps even more perilous. Every stone cut deep into the Valley of the Kings, every spell carved into the walls of a burial chamber, was meant to ensure that the pharaoh did not merely rest, but continued to reign beyond the grave. Yet behind all of these protective measures lurked something far darker, a belief that if the sanctity of the tomb was broken, if the eternal rest of the pharaoh was disturbed, then forces both divine and vengeful would awaken. The pharaohs spent their lives preparing for their deaths. Even before the crown was placed upon their head, preparations for a tomb might begin. For no ruler wanted to face the judgment of the gods without the right treasures, spells, and rituals in place. The construction of a tomb could take decades, involving thousands of laborers who carved winding corridors and hidden chambers into the limestone cliffs. To those workers, the labor was grueling but sacred, for they knew they were not just building a resting place, but an eternal fortress. They worked in silence, often under the watch of priests, who ensured that no one desecrated the holy task. And yet whispers still spread among them, rumors of what happened to those who violated the secrets of the dead. It was not only architecture that protected a pharaoh. The Egyptians turned to their priests and magician specialists in the unseen to weave incantations and place spells on the very air of the tomb. The Book of the Dead, a vast collection of spells, was inscribed in painted hieroglyphs across the walls, each one a charm meant to guard against dangers in the afterlife. Poisonous serpents, demons with knives, waters that burned like fire. But these spells had a second, unintended effect. For the living who dared enter these tombs, the words on the walls were not mere decoration. They were warnings, silent messages meant to instill fear in anyone bold enough to cross the threshold. Phrases like, "Death will come on swift wings to he who disturbs the king," were not metaphors. They were curses, crafted with the same intensity as any spell meant for the journey of the soul. Even ordinary objects within a tomb were charged with protective energy. Amulets in the shape of scarabs were buried with the king, their green stone surfaces believed to hold the magic of rebirth. Statues of gods lined the walls, their carved eyes following intruders in eternal vigilance. Canopic jars, holding the organs of the king, were sealed with lids shaped like sacred hedgehog, jackal, baboon, and human, each one guarding the essence of life. To remove them, to touch them, was to invite more than simple sacrilege. It was to court a curse that might outlast generations. Priests often went further, sealing entrances with rituals so elaborate they resembled theater. Incense would fill the corridors, smoke curling into spirals as chants echoed against stone walls. Words of binding, invoking gods like Anubis, the jackal-headed lord of the dead, or Sekhmet, the lioness of destruction, were spoken in solemn tones. The tomb itself became a temple of warning. To desecrate it was was to step into a place where gods had been directly called upon to protect the dead. The priests would often say little afterward, but among themselves, they believed that some tombs became charged with a presence, something invisible, yet felt in the silence of the halls long after the doors were sealed. The Egyptians had also mastered the art of fear. They understood that the idea of a curse could be just as powerful as the curse itself. Workers sometimes inscribed warnings at tomb entrances that read like threats. The crocodile shall devour, the serpent shall bite, the hippopotamus shall trample him who enters this tomb uninvited. To the common person, such words were more terrifying than armies. In a world where the Nile's floods determined survival, and where crocodiles truly lurked in its waters, these warnings were not just symbolic, they were promises of fate. To step inside was to accept that death might follow in a form both familiar and horrifying. The legacy of these protections outlasted Egypt itself. Centuries later, when Greeks and Romans came upon the tombs, they too spoke of curses and strange presences. They believed the Egyptians possessed hidden knowledge that allowed them to bind spirits and trap intruders with unseen forces. Even as empires rose and fell, the myth of Egyptian curses endured, growing larger with each retelling, until it became almost impossible to separate fear from reality. By the time European explorers entered Egypt thousands of years later, the ground was already seeded with stories that to disturb a tomb was to disturb something that should never have been touched. And yet, for all these elaborate protections, many pharaohs still failed to rest undisturbed. Tomb robbers in ancient Egypt were as determined as any modern treasure hunter. Driven by poverty, greed, or simple desperation, they dug through stone, tunneled through walls, and tore open sarcophagi to steal gold, jewelry, and precious artifacts. The Egyptians knew this would happen. Their records show countless trials where robbers were caught, tortured, and executed for desecrating tombs. Some were burned alive, others had their hands cut off, all as examples of what happened to those who violated the dead. But even punishments could not extinguish the hunger for riches buried beneath the sands. This is why the curses were crafted with such intensity. They were meant to succeed where earthly justice failed. Over time, stories of what happened to robbers spread like wildfire. A thief who entered a tomb might return home only to fall ill, his body wasting away as if consumed from within. Another might suffer accidents, his family struck by misfortune one after another, until his name was whispered with fear. Whether these tales were true or exaggerated hardly mattered. In the collective imagination, the curses of the pharaohs had become living things, shadows that followed those who trespassed. Even kings who followed the great dynasties were warned by their own priests, disturb the tombs of your ancestors, and you risk bringing ruin upon your reign. There is one question that lingers across time. Were the curses real, or were they simply the lingering echo of fear crafted by the priests? Modern scholars often argue that the so-called curses could be explained by natural causes: poisonous air trapped in sealed chambers, ancient molds that could infect lungs, toxic materials in mummies and wrappings. Others suggest coincidence, that deaths following a tomb's opening were accidents, strung together by human imagination. But to dismiss the ancient Egyptians' intentions is to overlook the depth of their belief in magic. To them, words and rituals were not symbolic, they were weapons. The same way a spear could pierce flesh, a curse could pierce the soul. If you stood in the Valley of the Kings, looking across its rocky cliffs, you would feel that same quiet dread that must have filled those who once labored there. Each tomb is more than stone. Each one is a reminder of the Pharaoh's obsession with eternity and the terrible consequences of trespassing against it. The silence itself feels heavy, as if the weight of thousands of years has not lessened the force of those ancient warnings. It leaves you with the thought that perhaps the Egyptians succeeded, perhaps their magic has not faded, and perhaps the curses still linger, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to test them. And so the question remains, whispered in the shadows of history. When tombs are opened and curses unleashed, are we simply confronting the remnants of superstition, or are we awakening something that was never meant to be disturbed? Section 3. The opening of tombs in modern times and the curse legends. When the modern world rediscovered ancient Egypt, it was not with reverence, but with curiosity that bordered on hunger. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe was gripped by a fascination with all things Egyptian. Napoleon's invasion had not only brought soldiers but scholars, who returned with sketches of towering temples, fragments of papyrus, and crates of artifacts. This Egyptomania swept across salons and universities alike, filling drawing rooms with statues of gods whose names had not been spoken in thousands of years. Yet behind the excitement lurked a darker undercurrent. For every object taken from the sands was once part of a sacred system meant to protect the dead. To pry it loose was not an act of preservation, but of desecration, and the stories that followed would prove that the ancient warnings were not so easily silenced. The most famous and chilling of these stories begins with the discovery of a single tomb, a moment in 1922 that changed both archaeology and folklore forever. For years, Howard Carter had searched in the Valley of the Kings, convinced that one last great prize remained hidden beneath the desert. His patron, Lord Carnarvon, had grown weary of the expense, but Carter persisted, following faint clues in the sands, like a man possessed. Then, on a November morning, a step was uncovered, a stone stairway buried beneath rubble that led down into the earth. Each step carried Carter and his men deeper into silence, until at last they reached a sealed doorway, its plaster unbroken, stamped with the jackal and 9 captives, the mark of the royal necropolis. What lay beyond was the tomb of Tutankhamun, the boy king who had ruled briefly and died young, but whose burial chamber had remained hidden from looters for over 3,000 years. When Carter peered through a small hole and held a candle inside, the sight he beheld was one that would haunt the world. "Wonderful things," he whispered, as the flickering light revealed golden statues, chariots, shrines, and treasures that gleamed as if the gods themselves had polished them. For a moment, the ancient magic of Egypt seemed alive again, but wonder soon turned to fear. Within months of the tomb's opening, Lord Carnarvon fell ill. It began with an infected mosquito bite, but quickly worsened into pneumonia and blood poisoning. He died in Cairo in April of 1923, barely half a year after the discovery. Newspapers across the world seized upon the story, proclaiming that the curse of the Pharaohs had claimed its first victim. They whispered of an inscription said to have been found inside the tomb. "Death will come on swift wings to him who disturbs the king." Though scholars debated whether the words were ever truly there, the public needed no proof. The curse had become real in their imagination, and the deaths that followed would only deepen the legend. Carnarvon's death was only the beginning. Strange stories surrounded it. At the very moment of his passing, the lights in Cairo reportedly flickered and went out. Back at his English estate, his dog let out a howl and collapsed, dying instantly as if tied to his master's fate. Skeptics dismissed these accounts as coincidence, yet they spread like wildfire, feeding a growing fear that something had been unleashed from the tomb. Other members of the expedition also suffered grim ends. George J. Gould, a wealthy American who had visited the tomb, died suddenly of fever shortly afterward. Arthur Mace, another archaeologist, succumbed to illness within a year. By 1929, nearly 24 people connected to the excavation were reported dead under unusual or sudden circumstances. Newspapers printed lists of names tallying the curse's victims, as though keeping score of a supernatural game. Whether the numbers were exaggerated hardly mattered. The public was enthralled by the idea that the pharaoh's wrath reached beyond the grave. Carter himself, curiously, lived on for many years, finally dying in 1939 at the age of 64. Yet, even his survival could not weaken the power of the curse in the popular imagination. Writers, filmmakers, and spiritualists seized upon it, crafting tales of mummies rising from their sarcophagi, of hieroglyphs that bled, of explorers who met grisly fates. Egypt was no longer just an ancient civilization. It was a realm of dread, a place where the boundaries between life and death blurred. Every artifact in a museum, every mummy displayed under glass, was seen by some not as a relic, but as a vessel of dark power. The stories did not end with Tutankhamun. In fact, they multiplied. Throughout the 20th century, other tombs yielded similar tales. When two French archaeologists opened a sealed burial site in the 1960s, both were reported to have died of sudden illnesses within weeks. In the 1970s, a British museum official who handled a mummy case fell into depression and took his own life, his colleagues whispering that he had been cursed. Even the Titanic disaster became tangled in the myth, when rumors spread that a cursed mummy case was aboard the ill-fated ship, its presence dooming all who sailed with it. These stories, whether exaggerated or fabricated, revealed something deeper about humanity's relationship with the dead. Modern science had dismissed curses as superstition, pointing instead to mold spores, ancient bacteria, or toxins sealed within the tombs that could harm intruders. Yet this explanation, while rational, could never capture the chill that spread down the spine of those who stood in the presence of a mummy. For in those moments, surrounded by the silent gaze of painted eyes and the smell of dust that had lain undisturbed for centuries, it was difficult not to feel that one was trespassing against something sacred. The Egyptians themselves would likely have nodded at this unease. They had built their curses not merely as warnings, but as spiritual weapons, designed to work whether the intruder believed in them or not. To their minds, the soul and the body were bound together, and to disturb one was to provoke the other. A king's Ka, his spiritual double, might linger in rage, striking down those who dared to strip him of his eternity. The protective gods, called upon by priests, might still hover invisibly around the chamber, their claws and teeth ready to punish. And if nothing else, the fear itself was a form of power, working into the minds of those who heard the stories until death and misfortune seemed inevitable. The curse legends also took root in a world already fascinated by the occult. In the Ijo Arling-s, spiritualism and ghost stories filled parlors across Europe and America. The idea of an ancient curse aligned perfectly with this hunger for mystery. Mediums claimed to feel the presence of pharaohs during their rituals. Writers spun tales of mummies that walked at night. Even Hollywood embraced the fear, birthing films that showed bandaged corpses rising to exact revenge. These fictional accounts, inspired by real tombs, in turn fed back into public belief, creating a cycle where myth and reality blurred until no one could separate them. To this day, the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb remains one of history's most haunting intersections of archaeology and folklore. Scientists may argue that Carnarvon died of infection, that Gould succumbed to fever, that Mace was weakened by years of labor in the desert. But the human imagination has never been satisfied with such mundane explanations. We crave meaning in death, and curses provide it a story in which every loss has a purpose, every tragedy a shadowy cause. The Egyptians understood this instinct intimately. By inscribing their warnings and weaving their rituals, they ensured that even thousands of years later, their power would linger, not just in stone and gold, but in fear itself. Walk today into the Egyptian Museum in Cairo or the British Museum in London, and you will see rows of mummies resting in glass cases. Their faces, painted in lifelike detail, stare outward, as if aware of the countless eyes upon them. Visitors shuffle past, whispering, sometimes laughing nervously. But deep down, many feel the same twinge of unease. The thought that these figures are not simply dead, but waiting. The legends of curses are alive, not because they have been proven, but because they have never been disproven. Each time tragedy strikes someone linked to Egypt's relics, the stories flare anew, like sparks from a fire that refuses to go out. It leaves us with a question more unsettling than any film or folktale. What if the Egyptians succeeded beyond their own imagining? What if their curses were not just spells for their own age, but weapons that endure through time, lying in wait for anyone who dares disturb the silence of the dead? Section 4. The haunting legacy of Egyptian curses in modern culture. The whispers of ancient Egypt did not end in the desert valleys where the tombs were first disturbed. They grew, spread, and reshaped themselves, drifting like restless spirits into the heart of modern culture. What began as rumors of a curse in Cairo soon became a mythology that bled into every corner of the 20th and 21st centuries. The story of the Pharaoh's wrath was no longer confined to archaeologists brushing sand from sarcophagi. It became a tale retold in newspapers, novels, films, and even whispered at candlelit in drawing rooms oceans away. The dead had found a way to live on, not through the eternity their priests had prepared for them, but through the imaginations of those who could not look upon Egypt without feeling both awe and dread. From the moment Tutankhamun's tomb was opened, a new archetype was born, the cursed mummy. Writers in London and New York seized upon it, blending fact with embellishment until it was nearly impossible to tell where history ended and horror began. The newspapers of the 1920s delighted in printing accounts of mysterious deaths connected to the excavation, not because they were proven, but because they sold, and with each headline, the legend grew. It was no longer just Lord Carnarvon who had died. It was dozens, perhaps hundreds, whose lives were supposedly claimed by the ancient curse. In reality, many of these deaths had ordinary explanations. Yet, for the public, the ordinary was never as gripping as the uncanny. This hunger for the supernatural quickly found its way into popular entertainment. In 1932, Universal Studios released The Mummy, a film that drew heavily from the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. Boris Karloff, wrapped in linen and cursed to live again, stalked the screen with hollow eyes, bringing to life the fears that had haunted Western audiences for a decade. It was not an accurate reflection of Egyptian belief, nor did it attempt to beat was horror dressed in exotic robes. Yet it struck a nerve, and from that moment forward, the mummy was no longer just a historical artifact. It was a monster. But while Hollywood reveled in bandaged corpses and tomb robbers, punishments, elsewhere the legends manifested in subtler ways. Museums reported strange occurrences, whispers in empty halls, unexplained sickness among staff, sudden accidents when ancient objects were moved. Visitors would faint before mummies or claim to feel watched. Curators tried to explain these away as nerves or suggestion, but the stories persisted. In London, one particularly famous artifact, the so-called unlucky mummy, actually the coffin lid of a priestess from the 21st dynasty, gained a reputation so dark that it was said to have been hidden away in the British Museum's basement. Legends claimed it was aboard the Titanic when the ship sank, its presence ensuring disaster. None of this was true, yet the fact that such tales were believed at all shows how deeply the Egyptian curse had embedded itself in the modern psyche. The allure of these curses went beyond fear. They touched something primal, humanity's unease with disturbing the dead. Unlike medieval graves or Viking burials, Egyptian tombs were not simple resting places, but entire worlds crafted for eternity. To break into them was not just to steal objects, but to dismantle a cosmology. The walls were covered in spells, the coffins inscribed with prayers, the treasures chosen with care to ensure the soul's safe passage. When explorers pried open sarcophagi and carried relics across continents, they were, in a sense, undoing the work of priests who had labored to secure immortality. Small wonder that so many felt the act would demand a price. By the mid-20th century, the curse of the Pharaohs was no longer a superstition whispered by locals, it was a global phenomenon. Writers like Agatha Christie wove it into fiction, while pulp magazines spread lurid tales of mummies rising from their tombs. Spiritualists held where they claimed to channel the voices of long-dead pharaohs. Even scientists, though skeptical, were drawn into the debate, with microbiologists investigating whether deadly spores could survive sealed inside tombs for millennia. Some argued that the musty air within sarcophagi might carry bacteria capable of infecting intruders. Yet others pointed out that the curse seemed to strike with uncanny selectivity, sparing some while dooming others. To believers, this was proof enough that the pharaoh's wrath was not a matter of chance. The fascination only deepened as Egypt itself became more accessible. Tourists flocked to Cairo, eager to walk among the relics of the dead. Many took home small souvenirs, sometimes legitimate trinkets, other times stolen fragments of tomb walls or burial goods. And with those fragments, the stories followed. Letters survive from travelers who begged museums to take back shards of artifacts they had pocketed, claiming their lives had been plagued by accidents, illness, and misfortune ever since. These confessions read like desperate pleas to appease spirits they had angered. In some cases, items were even returned anonymously by mail, left on museum steps in the dead of night, as if their owners feared being cursed until the last moment of their lives. The power of these legends lies in how they have been woven into the fabric of modern culture. They are not confined to Egypt, but echo across the world, wherever a mummy is displayed. In North America, Visitors to museum exhibits have reported hearing footsteps in empty galleries or seeing shadows move behind glass cases. In Europe, guards have quit their posts, claiming they could no longer endure the feeling of being watched by the dead. Even in modern Cairo, archaeologists speak quietly of bad luck that follows those who disturb certain tombs, though they rarely do so on record. The stories seep into art and music as well. Gothic novels of the Victorian era planted seeds that would later flourish in cinema. Rock bands in the 1970s and 1980s wrote songs invoking mummies and Egyptian curses, their stage shows adorned with imagery of pyramids and pharaohs rising from the grave. Horror writers returned to the theme again and again, seeing in it a perfect marriage of the exotic and the terrifying. The Pharaoh's curse became shorthand for forbidden knowledge, ancient power, and the price of hubris. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of all is that these legends continue to grow, even in the 21st century, when science has mapped genomes and sent probes to other planets. The allure of the curse endures. When new tombs are discovered, the old warnings are revived. In 2021, when Egyptian authorities moved dozens of royal mummies through the streets of Cairo in a grand parade, whispers spread across social media that disturbing their rest would bring disaster. When the Suez Canal was blocked shortly afterward by the stranded ship Ever Given, thousands online joked half believed that it was the Pharaoh's revenge. It seems that even in the digital age, the old magic still has power. What explains this persistence? Perhaps it is because death itself remains the one mystery science cannot conquer. The Egyptians devoted their civilization to preparing for it, building tombs, temples, and texts that sought to guide the soul beyond. In disturbing those preparations, we are reminded of our own fragility, our own inability to control what lies after. The curse is, in this sense, less about the pharaohs than about us. It is the embodiment of guilt, of the suspicion that in taking from the dead, we awaken forces we cannot understand. And so, the haunting legacy continues. Children learn of mummies in classrooms, not just as historical figures, but as monsters lurking in myth. Adults watch horror films where curses claim those who dare to read forbidden texts. Tourists tread softly through museums, their laughter edged with nervousness. Each retelling, each shiver ensures that the pharaohs are not forgotten. In life, their reigns were brief. In death, their power has stretched across centuries. The sands of Egypt still hold countless secrets. There are tombs yet unopened, chambers still sealed, treasures still waiting in silence. What stories will emerge when they are revealed? Will science again explain away the strange fates that follow? Or will the whispers of curses return, louder than before? The legacy of Egypt's curses is not one of proof or evidence, but of endurance. It lives because we believe it, because deep within us there is a part that trembles at the thought of disturbing the eternal. And as long as that fear remains, the curses of the pharaohs will never truly die. Story 2. The Tragedy of Lord Carnarvon. When the winter of 1922 gave way to the mild warmth of an Egyptian spring, the Valley of the Kings still slept beneath centuries of sand and silence. For years, the desert had hidden its dead, sheltering them from the eyes of intruders. That was until a wealthy English aristocrat, George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, along with his determined archaeologist partner Howard Carter, forced the desert to yield one of its most astonishing secrets. Tutankhamun's tomits, golden treasures glittering like frozen firelight, was pried open, and with it, so too were whispers of something darker, something unseen. Lord Carnarvon had bankrolled Carter's desperate quest for years. Money had poured from his estate at Highclere Castle, the same estate that future generations would know as the set for Downton Abbey. He was a man drawn to the exotic, a thrill-seeker turned fragile invalid after a motoring accident left him with a weak constitution. Egypt's dry air suited him, and archaeology became his obsession. Yet when he stood before Tutankhamun's sealed door, something more than curiosity stirred. Ancient warnings, etched in hieroglyphs across centuries, had been ignored countless times, but this tomb bore an aura heavy enough to chill even the bravest. On November 26, 1922, Carter and Carnarvon finally gazed into the boy king's resting place. Candles flickered against painted walls that seemed to whisper in the half-light. Gold, alabaster, ivory, all treasures fit for a god lay untouched. Carter recalled the moment when Carnarvon asked, his voice trembling like a schoolboy, "Can you see anything?" To which Carter famously replied, "Yes, wonderful things." But among those wonderful things lurked a sense of dread. It is said that Carter's pet canary, kept at his lodgings, was devoured that very evening by a cobran animal sacred to the Pharaohs and a protector of kings. Locals murmured that the spirit of Tutankhamun had sent a warning, a sign of wrath. Carnarvon laughed off the tale, but laughter does not silence whispers in the desert night. Weeks passed as treasures were catalogued and rumors spread. Newspapers devoured every scrap of gossip, printing half-truths and fabrications that turned the excavation into theater. Egyptian workers muttered of curses that awaited those who disturbed the royal dead. Priests shook their heads at the blasphemy. Even as sunlight glittered across the Nile, a shadow seemed to grow longer over Carnarvon's shoulder. By March of 1923, the Earl had taken residence in Cairo's Savoy Hotel, indulging in luxuries while overseeing the dig. He had suffered from ill health most of his adult life, but now he seemed pale, distracted, as though unseen eyes followed his every movement. He shaved one morning, nicking a mosquito bite on his cheek. To a modern ear, it sounds trivial, but infection set in quickly. The wound festered, and his frail body, weakened by years of illness, could not fight back. He developed a raging fever, delirium setting in as Cairo's air grew heavy with spring rains. On April 5, 1923, at precisely 2 a.m., Lord Carnarvon died. The official cause, blood poisoning from an infected mosquito bite. Yet the whispers drowned out the doctor's words. At the moment of his death, Cairo was plunged into sudden darkness, the city's lights mysteriously extinguished, leaving its streets wrapped in pitch-black silence. His beloved dog, Loti, back in England, let out a long, eerie howl and collapsed dead at that same hour, according to his family. To the public, this was no coincidence. This was the curse. Reporters leaped upon the story like scavengers. Death comes on wings to he who enters the tomb of a pharaoh, one paper proclaimed, claiming the words had been carved at the entrance to Tutankhamun's chamber. In truth, no such inscription existed, but accuracy no longer mattered. A new legend was born. Carnarvon's death became the centerpiece of a narrative that would grip the world, the curse of the Pharaohs. Within months, more supposed victims were added to the tally. Others, who had been connected with the tomb, began dying sudden or unusual deaths. A radiologist who examined Tutankhamun perished of a mysterious illness. A wealthy financier involved in the dig collapsed in a Cairo club. Rumors magnified each event until it seemed as though the boy king himself was stretching spectral hands beyond the grave, exacting vengeance on those who disturbed him. In London and New York were held where mediums claimed to hear Tutankhamun's wrathful voice. One clairvoyant announced that the Avenger of the Tomb had been unleashed, and no power on earth could halt it. The story snowballed into hysteria. Cairo's bazaars thrummed with fear. Egyptian guides refused to approach the Valley of the Kings after sunset. And yet some details gnawed at the edges of reason. Carter himself lived another 16 years after the discovery, dying peacefully in 1939. Many others associated with the excavation lived long lives. Statisticians later argued that the supposed curse victims died at rates no higher than average. But the mind clings to mystery, not math. It remembers the lights that went out over Cairo the night Carnarvon died, the dog that howled across oceans, the cobra that ate Carter's canary. Coincidences, skeptics say. Signs, believers whisper. Carnarvon's body was shipped back to England, interred at his estate. On his gravestone was etched a line that unsettled many who read it. May your spirit live, may you spend millions of years, you who love. Thebes, sitting with your face to the north wind, your eyes beholding happiness. It was an echo of ancient Egyptian blessings, as though Carnarvon himself had joined the very pharaohs whose rest he disturbed. The legend of his death refused to die. Each retelling grew darker, more embellished. Some claimed that his wound mirrored the same location on Tutankhamun's mummified face where damage was visible. Others swore that Carnarvon had suffered terrifying visions in his final fever, crying out that they have come for me. Whether true or not, these words slipped easily into the narrative and rooted themselves there like ivy on stone. In the quiet of the Valley of the Kings, where hot winds still sweep the sands, the story of Lord Carnarvon endures. His tragedy is more than history. It is theater, folklore, ghost story, and warning. When travelers gaze upon Tutankhamun's treasures in the sterile light of museums, few remember the fevered man who made that moment possible and who paid with his life. For every gleam of gold and flash of jewel, there is a shadow, and in that shadow waits the boy king, silent and watching, his revenge forever tied to the name Carnarvon. And so the tale lingers, not just in textbooks, but in dreams. When rain patters softly against windows and candles burn low, one might imagine the hush of a tomb being opened, the flutter of a canary's wings before silence, the sting of a mosquito's bite, and the sudden plunge into darkness. The curse, real or imagined, is not only Tutankhamun's, it is the curse of curiosity, of men who sought eternity in the sands and found instead a shadow that has never lifted. Story 3: The Lost Expedition of Pierre Loti. The Nile has always carried more than water. It has carried secrets, voices, and the restless dreams of those who gazed into its depths, set out on a journey that would etch his name in the folklore of explorers who crossed the line between the living and the dead. He was not an archaeologist in the strict sense, nor a man of science. Loti was a novelist, a dreamer, a seeker of sensations, who believed that travel was a way to peel back the thin fabric between reality and the mysteries that lurked beyond. Yet his fascination with Egypt drew him into places where even seasoned explorers hesitated to tread. Pierre Loti arrived in Egypt in 1907 with an entourage of artists and assistants. his notebooks ready to be filled with impressions, sketches, and prose. He had been warned that the desert was merciless, that its tombs were more than empty chambers, but vessels of something heavy, something alive in silence. Still, Loti was intoxicated by the romance of antiquity. He dressed himself in flowing robes like a pharaoh of old, an actor stepping into the role of a man meant to walk between worlds. Locals regarded him with unease, whispering that he invited danger by mocking the very spirits who watched over the sands. His journey led him south into Thebes, where cliffs rose like the walls of a forgotten fortress, and the Valley of the Kings lay under the weight of centuries. Guides told him that there were places no man should enter without permission, corridors where the air itself carried warnings. Loti listened, his pen scratching across pages, every tale of curses and vengeful gods feeding his restless imagination. One evening, by lantern light in a small Luxor cafe, he was told of a tomb not officially mapped, one half swallowed by stone in time, where the air had the taste of iron and salt, and carvings were etched not in honor of gods, but in defiance of them. He demanded to see it. At dawn, his party followed reluctant locals to the site, a crumbling crevice half hidden in the rock. A foul odor seeped out, as though the earth itself resisted their presence. The guides refused to step inside, crossing themselves and whispering prayers. But Loti pressed on, dragging his companions with him, carrying lamps that threw long shadows on painted walls. The deeper they walked, the heavier the air grew, until it pressed upon their chests like a hand. Loti recorded feverishly, his handwriting jagged, noting that these images were unlike any catalogued in Egyptology. They spoke of forbidden rites, of pharaohs who had turned not to Osiris, lord of the afterlife. It was not ornate like Tutankhamun's, nor regal like Ramses. Instead, it was plain, dark stone, but carved along its edges were words in red pigment that had not faded with time. None in his group could translate them, but one assistant claimed the markings were warnings, not blessings. Still, Loti leaned close, tracing the grooves with his fingers, inhaling the dust of centuries. His companions begged him to leave. He refused. That night, back at his lodgings, he fell into a fever. He muttered in his sleep, phrases in a language none could recognize, his body twisting, sweat soaking the sheets. He described visions of hands reaching out from the tomb walls, of voices calling his name, urging him to return. When he awoke, his eyes seemed clouded, distant. The following weeks grew stranger. His notes became illegible, filled with half-drawn sigils and lines of poetry that made no sense. He began to wear black robes, abandoning the colorful silks he once adored. At dinners in Cairo, he would stare at fellow guests without speaking until they turned away, unnerved. He claimed that the figure within the sarcophagus was not dead, not in the sense men understood, but waiting. That the tomb had been a prison, not a grave. His words unsettled even his loyal companions, and soon many abandoned him, unwilling to follow a man who seemed haunted. He returned to France months later, but Egypt never released him. In his seaside home, far from the Nile's banks, he would close himself in a study heavy with incense, reliving his visions, sketching the same distorted figures he had seen on those walls. Servants swore that sometimes they heard chanting in the middle of the night, in a voice that did not sound like his own. His health, once robust, declined rapidly. His skin grew sallow, his eyes sunken. Witnesses said he had been in the middle of reciting verses in guttural tones, words unlike French or Arabic or any known tongue. When he fell, the room shook as though from a passing tremor, though no such tremor was recorded by others nearby. He died within minutes, his last words whispered in delirium. "They are here." His journals, preserved by his family, were examined later. Many pages were indecipherable, filled with scrawls that seemed to mimic hieroglyphs, but twisted, inverted, broken apart into something alien. Scholars dismissed them as the product of a fevered mind. The location of the tomb he claimed to have entered was never found again. No maps led to it, no workers admitted to knowing its existence. Some whispered that it sealed itself after he left, as though the desert swallowed it whole. Others said that those who had guided him swore secrecy, fearing that to reveal it would bring doom. Whatever the truth, Pierre Loti's name became entwined with that of Egypt's shadows, not as a discoverer, but as one who trespassed where he should not have, and who paid the price. Even today, among Egyptologists, his story lingers like smoke. Some laugh it off as Gothic melodrama, the fevered tales of a writer too eager to turn life into fiction. Yet others lower their voices and admit that there are still tombs in the Valley of the Kings never touched. And sometimes, in the quiet hours, one remembers Loti's words, his trembling voice as he lay dying. They are here. Story 4. The Priest's Revenge at Karnak. The temple of Karnak rises from the sands like a forest of stone. Columns towering higher than trees, their tops lost in shadow even beneath the desert sun. It is a place of splendor, of ceremony, of gods carved into eternity. But behind its grandeur lies something few speak of, something that lingers in whispers carried by wind through shattered courtyards. The story of a priest betrayed, silenced, and left to rot beneath the sacred halls, who did not rest even in death. The tale begins in the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, when Karnak was at its height, a place where priests wielded power as mighty as kings. Among them was a man named Nesimon, a high priest of Ammon, chosen for his knowledge of rites and his voice in sacred hymns. He was said to sing with such clarity that the gods themselves paused to listen. Yet power breeds envy, and Nesimon's influence grew to a point that unsettled others within the temple. His rivals whispered that his devotion was not to Amen, but to himself, that his ambitions stretched further than worship, perhaps even to the throne. One night, during a festival of Opet, when the Nile was swelling and offerings filled the courtyards, Nesimon was accused of blasphemy. Witnesses claimed they had heard him invoke forbidden names, gods exiled from the pantheon, voices not meant to be spoken. Whether the accusations were true or fabricated, the judgment was swift. He was stripped of his robes, dragged before the assembly of priests, and condemned to a punishment worse than death. For to deny a priest burial was to deny him eternity. They did not mummify him. They bound him in linen, but left his body to rot in the earth, sealed in a pit beneath Karnak's stones, where no prayers were spoken, no rituals performed. His soul, they believed, would never cross into the field of reeds, forever wandering in shadow. His rivals thought this would erase him. They were wrong. The first signs came quietly. Months after his death, the sacred singers found their throats dry, their voices cracking during hymns, as though the god of song had abandoned them. Acolytes woke in the night to find hieroglyphs smeared across walls, fresh as though carved in wet clay, warning of vengeance. Priests fell ill, their tongues blackened, their voices stolen. One after another, those who had stood against Nesaman lost the gift of speech, struck mute in the very halls where they had condemned him. At first, the elders dismissed it as coincidence, or the wrath of Ammon punishing their carelessness. But the affliction spread only to those who had spoken his name in judgment. And at night, the temple guards reported hearing chanting echoing in the hypostyle hall when no one stood there. Low, guttural chants in a voice that was not entirely human, the sound carrying through the forest of stone pillars, like a curse woven into the architecture itself. One guard, trembling, swore that he saw a shadow move across the columns, a figure robed in linen strips that hung like rotting flesh. It turned its head toward him, and though its mouth was sewn shut with black thread, the guard heard it whisper his name. He fled, but by dawn he was found dead in his quarters, his face contorted in a scream, though no sound had escaped his lips. Fear gripped Karnak. The priests performed exorcisms, offerings, sacrifices of cattle and fowl. They poured libations into the earth where Nesaman's body had been buried, but nothing silenced the whispers. In fact, the more they tried to appease the gods, the louder the haunting grew. Some said that Nesaman had indeed called on forbidden deities in his final hours, not for blasphemy but for vengeance, making a pact with powers older than Ammon, older even than Ra, powers that thrived in the silence between prayers. In desperation, the remaining high priests ordered the pit to be opened. By torchlight, men descended into the chamber where he had been sealed. The air was heavy, choking with the stench of decay. The body lay twisted, linen peeling away, skin clinging to bone. But his eyes were not empty. They were wet, glistening, staring with a hatred so raw that the men recoiled. One swore he saw the lips beneath the thread move, forming words. They sealed the pit again in terror, burying it beneath heavier stones, swearing never to speak of it. But silence did not end the curse. Over the years, those who had sat in judgment of Nesaman met strange ends. Some suffocated in their sleep, lungs filled with unseen weight. Some drowned in shallow basins of water, their voices lost in gurgling death, and others simply vanished within the labyrinthine halls of Karnak, their torches found smoldering on the ground, no trace of their bodies ever recovered. The legend outlived the priests, outlived Amenhotep, outlived dynasties. Pilgrims avoided certain corners of the temple where the echo of footsteps did not belong to the living. Scribes recorded whispers caught in the sandstone, voices reciting hymns in tones too deep for any man. Guides told of cold draughts rising from the floor, carrying with them the smell of rot. Centuries later, when modern archaeologists arrived, they too felt the weight of the tale. In the late 1800s, a British Egyptologist, Margaret Benson, working at Karnak, noted in her diary that she felt watched in the hypostyle hall, and once, while sketching inscriptions, her voice faltered as though seized in her throat. She wrote of dreaming of a man in tattered linen, his mouth sewn shut, who stood over her bed whispering, though no sound came out. She left Karnak within weeks, her health failing, and never returned. In the 20th century, excavations near the supposed burial pit revealed nothing but sand and stone. Yet workers refused to continue after several fell ill with inexplicable throat infections. A French archaeologist who insisted on pressing further was found dead in his tent, his face blue, his windpipe swollen shut. His notes ended mid-sentence, "I hear him." The rest was ink smeared by a trembling hand. Even now, visitors to Karnak speak of an unease in the air, a stillness too heavy for an open space. Some say, if you stand alone among the pillars at dusk, you will hear faint chanting, not in Arabic, not in Coptic, but in a language that vibrates in your bones. And if you linger too long, you might feel breath on your neck, a presence waiting for you to speak, because the curse of Nesaman is not silence. It is hunger for voices, a theft of sound, a punishment eternal. The story endures, not in official histories, but in the margins, in the whispered accounts of guards, tourists, scholars who will not admit what they've felt. It is said that the soul of Nesaman never crossed into the field of reeds, that he lingers still. A priest denied his eternity, his hatred woven into Karnak stones, and that those who mocked him in life remain his victims in death, their voices silenced forever in the shadow of pillars that once rang with hymns.